How you doing,
Hi there.
sir?
Not too bad, not too bad. Um, but I have been slightly unexpectedly, we just had extraordinary, very, very high net immigration figures for the year to June
Oh,
2022.
new pieces coming out, I'm sure.
Because kind of migration is one of my subjects. So I've been kind of writing quite a lot of stuff. And also my partner is on a knife edge selling a house with lots of last minute kind of um, problems with the buyer
Mm.
querying various things annoyingly. So anyway, but so mainly to explain why I haven't really done any prep at all. I can't remember the kind of what you're doing a journalism.
Yeah,
You're,
yeah.
you're
So
doing
I have
yeah.
a,
Go on.
a brief introduction, if I can. I
Yeah.
wrote it out so I wouldn't forget it. So just, to preface, I was assigned your book, The Road to Somewhere, in August as part of the general course curriculum of a class I was taking. Um, the course was on the debates between nationalism and globalism in the realm of world politics, and your book, The Road to Somewhere, was assigned first in the course. For both myself and my fellow students, it was sort of a guiding light for future discussions we would have. Specifically, the Anywhere Somewhere paradigm was particularly useful for helping us characterize writers like Pierre Monet or David Held or Francis Fukuyama. So I wanted to first thank you for joining me and providing such an insightful paradigm. To further preface sort of what this specific interview is about, I want to tell you that, I'm a journalist by trade, uh, you know, still in school, about to graduate in December. I've been practicing for about 5 years total through a variety of different local, digital, and national newspapers, with my most recent position being at the Arizona Republic's breaking news desk. Uh,
Mm.
Along every step of the way through both my career and journalism school, I've encountered the sort of thinking you've characterized as belonging to anywheres. It is my hope that through this conversation, you can speak further on the existence of anywhereism in the news media with the hopes of furthering the dialogue and debate within the industry as to what journalism is and what it should be striving for.
Mm. Mm.
So my
Well,
thesis,
yeah. Sorry. Go on.
sure,
Go on. Go
one
on.
last little bit. My thesis argument, as one last piece of context, is
Mm.
that as represented by both current news culture, digital business models, and coverage statistics, the journalism industry has overwhelmingly shifted towards a globalized anywhere perspective at the cost of coverage and true representation of somewhere issues.
Yeah, well, I think that's really interesting. Well, I'm very flattered. I'm also very glad that my book is on courses in the US. It was never really published properly in the US, which was a bit disappointing. Um, and also, I mean, as you will know, having read it, my much of my raw material is drawn from the UK. So it's also good that obviously I kind of refer to the US in certain parts of the book and indeed other European countries, but it was quite UK centric. But I'm glad to discover that the argument kind of works in the US too, with many of the same trends. I actually wrote a bit more about my follow-up book was called Head, Hand, Heart, The Struggle for Dignity and Status in the 21st Century, which that was actually published in the US, although I slightly preferred the UK edition. And there was some silly, it was, what are they called? Simon and Schuster published it, and they insisted on some rather silly subtitle to the book, which I didn't really like. But anyway, if you're interested in my stuff, I mean, hopefully you might find that interesting too. I mean, it's basically extended, as the title suggests, it's basically arguing that we've allocated too much reward and prestige to just one form of human aptitude, kind of cognitive, analytical, exam passing intelligence, and that's contributed to people with other kinds of aptitudes feeling their contribution is not valued. And so yeah, I mean, I think journalism, I mean, the worst example of this, I guess, recently has been the complete takeover of really quite extreme and sort of sectarian Anywhere worldview on the New York Times, you know, the once great newspaper that is just completely blinkered. It's really rather kind of embarrassing. Whenever they write about the UK, it's just you just want to laugh. It's just so poor, and you know, such a sort of and so opinionated in an ill-informed way. It's extraordinary. I mean, yeah, I mean, there is, you know, journalists tend to, I mean, certainly recently, I mean, there was a big shift actually in the UK. It may have been the same in the US too, about a kind of couple of generations ago. I mean, when I trained on a local newspaper in the north of England, the graduate journalist like me was still quite a rare thing. Journalism, except at the very elite level, in national newspapers, and even then it was not entirely the case. Most journalists were kind of clever school leavers, you know, people who hadn't gone on to college, were sort of capable school leavers, you know, who had a, you know, who were kind of much closer to real somewhere life and interests. The great Sunday Times editor Harry Evans, you know, who was married to, he married to what's her face, who edited the New Yorker, the British woman. Who was the editor of the New Yorker? Woman, was she the first woman? Can't remember her name anyway. Yeah, Harry Evans was kind of not untypical even for a national newspaper editor, in coming from a working class, lower middle class background, not going to university. Now, all that really changed dramatically in the 70s and the 80s in the UK. I mean, obviously I don't know the story in the US so much, but I suspect that. And then you got the kind of emergence of, is where sort of postgraduate journalists too, people who'd done degrees and then did one-year journalism courses. I mean, of course, you can also do I guess you can do journalism as a sort of main degree course too, although that's relatively rare, I think, here in the UK anyway. So that, I think that has sort of contributed to, I mean, you know, added to which I suppose, you know, journalists have tended to be, I was going to say that they've tended to, I mean, so writers and journalists, I guess, are a sort of subset of writers, are often kind of somewhat on the left, you know, kind of at a bit of an angle to sort of established, or, you know, and you might say ought to be, and indeed what's failed recently is they've stopped being at an angle to the establishment, as the establishment has become increasingly liberal, certainly in the media. Well, of course, you know, you have your very polarized situation, but you know, the BBC, for example, I mean, most BBC journalists from you know, from many decades now have been graduates, you know, mainly middle class, and you know, reflecting a kind of instinctive sort of moderate liberalism. You know, their idea of where the kind of centre of politics lies, you know, is, you know, somewhere between kind of moderate centre right and moderate centre left, but, you know, they're all anywheres. And, you know, populist parties are, you know, kind of quite openly disparaged often. And, you know, Brexit was, you know, the kind of, you know, Brexit and Trump are just I mean, particularly Trump, obviously, but you know, even Brexit was quite openly sometimes sort of, you know, and of course they've you know, catastrophizing over climate change and, you know, the whole package. Can I think of any good examples? I'll have to sort of rack my brains
Sure.
about.
I have a few questions, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. The other thing I was going to say was that, you know, I mean, I think your sort of work is rather important to me. I mean, just as, you know, what we need for our politics is to find politicians who can somehow straddle both anywhere, you know, both anywhere and somewhere worldviews are perfectly decent and legitimate, at least in their mainstream kind of non-extreme forms. But you know, they are to some extent in conflict too, and you know, we need new generations of politicians who can sort of straddle the divide. You know, who can be a bridge between anywheres and somewheres. And I think I haven't really thought about this very much, but I think it also kind of applies to a lot of sort of professional jobs too, which have tended to be absolutely dominated by anywhere instincts. Actually, one little story, it's not a journalism story, but somebody I met the other day who had read my book, and when they discovered I was the author of the book, had sort of said, you know, how funny, because they were hoping to bump into me to tell me this story. She was a young lawyer working in I think it was Norton Rose. They're a big sort of kick-ass legal firm, do a lot of kind of financial stuff. I mean, they're all very, you know, very well paid, you know, top of the range stuff. And she was saying that just before the Brexit vote, she was a bit more kind of Brexit sympathetic. I think she was a Remain voter, but she was sort of, you know, a bit more Brexit sympathetic than most of her colleagues, perhaps a little bit more small c conservative. And she remembers the head of the firm actually emailing everybody saying, well, I kind of assume we're all going to be voting Remain. It's certainly in the company's interests, you know, all our clients will be clearly hoping for a Remain vote. So, you know, not exactly instructing them to vote Remain, but sort of pushing very strongly in that direction. And then I think on the night before the day of when the vote took place, she got an email from her immediate supervisor saying, of course, you know, take as long as you like to, you know, make sure you could go out and, you know, vote early, vote often, kind of thing. But don't tell the secretaries. I mean, you couldn't make that up, could you? Don't tell the secretaries, you know, meaning the kind of more administrative, lower status people who, you know, they all feared might go out and vote for Brexit. I mean, it just, so, you know, we need, a more somewhere presence in these elite professions, and perhaps most important of all in journalism, which, you know, has all those extra responsibilities. Anyway, yeah, fire a few questions at me, and I'm afraid I'm not, but partly because I've got to go on the, I've got to prep for I've got to go on the TV and talk about the migration figures a bit later, so I can't hang around as long as I would have liked to. But we can talk again in the future. But so I'll have to go in 7, 8, 10 minutes or something. So far away with what, and I can see how far we can get now.
Sure. So I'll start with a couple interesting polls that I'm going to be using for my report. A Pew Research poll conducted in 2022 found roughly 6 in 10 U.S. journalists aged 18 to 29 say they do not believe every side deserves equal coverage. This gap lessens with age, with older generations moving towards more of a 50-50 split on this issue. You believe that this shift in media perception, primarily among young journalists, demonstrates a rise of anywhereism as described in your book? And why do you think young journalists particularly are so overwhelmingly anywhere?
Well, partly because of the kind of woke takeover of higher education in the last sort of 20 years or so. Yeah, and it's people looking for a cause. I mean, like I said earlier, I mean, people who go into journalism often think of themselves as sort of slightly radical. I mean, of course, most people who think of themselves as radical are not at all radical. I mean, they're just sort of imbibing a whole sort of splurge of views, many of which are inconsistent with each other, etc., etc. But yeah, I mean, it's that. I mean, I think it's the sort of modern. I mean, that radicalism, I think, used to be tempered by a kind of a journalistic ethos, which meant that you weren't politically active. You certainly, you weren't an active member of a political party, or I definitely remember that feeling from kind of older journalists when I was starting up in my early 20s on a paper, the York Evening Press in the north of England. That sense you should be a bit sort of above party politics, and you might have your own convictions, but you sort of keep you keep them quiet, and that you're there to report the news well, and that sense has been eroded, I think, in a lot of professions. I mean, as as kind of what it is to be a good person has increasingly been defined in terms of a kind of sort of woke activism. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm actually surprised it's as low as 6 in 10. I mean, I think actually that's in a way quite encouraging. That at least 40% are still holding to a kind of older notion of kind of balance and objectivity.
Yeah. A second question, again, going back to Pew Research poll, in 2021, they noted in just 5 years, the percentage of Republicans with at least some trust in national news organizations had been cut in half, from 70% to 35%. Another Pew poll published in 2020 found more than half of US adults say their news outlets do not particularly value them, and slightly more say that news organizations do not, quote, understand people like them, end quote. Within The Road to Somewhere, you offer warnings to the world about a lack of representation causing sort of these new populist uprisings. Do you believe that anywhereism in journalism has been contributive to this underrepresentation? And if so, where do you predict that it's going, or how is it appearing in popular media?
Oh no, I think it's definitely a factor. Yeah, I know. I mean, a sense that a sort of more recent, liberal-minded, university-educated, sort of professional class has, and you've had mass higher education sort of since the GI Bill back in the 40s and 50s. It's relatively more recent here, but I think in both countries, yeah, it's I think this feeling really kind of took off when kind of anywhereism really sort of emerged, I guess, in the post-Cold War period, the early 90s, Clinton in America, Blair in the later 90s here, with the main party of working people or poorer people completely captured by liberal-minded graduates, and where you started to get that flip that has gathered pace since. And no, I think it's clearly the case that a disproportionate number of of people in charge of disseminating the news, whether in newspapers or in electronic media, I mean, have just started to speak to people like themselves, and have reflected quite a narrow range of opinion. Yeah, I mean, I think, and people have noticed. This is not kind of Walter Cronkite. This is a different generation of kind of not everywhere obviously, but the kind of CNNs and the I mean, it's kind of what led to the polarization. I mean, because as it were, the traditional media got increasingly taken over. I mean, I'm not an expert on sort of the media history of the last 20 or 30 years, but I mean, my impression was that, as it were, the kind of BBC equivalents, the outlets that used to be trusted by most people. And actually, I think the BBC, I mean, it is one of the differences, I guess, between the UK and America, is that we do still have BBC, which, although, I mean, it has been partly affected by this, but I think less radically than the US. I mean, when you saw CNN and some of the other big outlets, really going for the kind of, self-righteous activist journalism, I think, it repelled a lot of people, and, and hence, Fox News and so on became far more popular, and you're then left with that polarization. There isn't really a trusted source of electronic news. Yeah.
So do you believe in the rise in digital journalism? For example, Twitter has also, added to the rise of Anywhereism in the industry.
I think so. I mean, people always say, don't they, that Twitter has a sort of liberal bias. I mean, obviously lots of different people are on Twitter, but again, it's that sort of, opinionated people, taken as a whole, often, they want to change the world. They tend to be, they're less respectful of tradition and authority than your average person, and that kind of tendency has been kind of unleashed recently, or to put it the other way, the kind of constraints on that have fallen away a bit. Obviously, particularly in the liberal media. There is a sort of bias in favour of. I mean, I think sort of journalists are probably, actually, to put it another way, journalists are probably a bit like, well, kind of highly educated people generally. The people in the intelligentsia, people in the kind of creative worlds, people who live by ideas and words, have a kind of inherent bias towards the kind of free flow of ideas. As no doubt you and I do too. But I think that sort of gives them a rather unthinking sense that the kind of free flow of everything is fine. That it gives them a bias towards openness in kind of immigration, as well as the free flow of ideas. You can have a free flow of ideas from lots of different countries in the world without everybody having to come and live in your country. And I think people have often, I think, naively associated that kind of openness with progress. And sometimes that has been true, I think. But there is another side to the argument, and that's gone completely unheard. I think that openness can also lead to over rapid change. The average person tends to lean towards wanting security and familiarity, and a society that's kind of driven by openness, the kind of openness that most writers and academics and journalists sort of take for granted and like, is not shared by everybody. And as you say, those other voices, there used to be, well, a kind of combination of the those other voices used to be louder, and journalists used to be more respectful of sort of boundaries in a way. And anyway, I'm afraid I'm going to have to go.
Sure.
But we could either talk again at some point, or send me some of the any more questions on email if you like.
Yeah, will do. Enjoy your segment. Hope it's a good one.
Oh, thanks. So where are you speaking from now? Are you in Arizona?
So yeah, so this is Arizona. This is part of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership's general curriculum. This is a final essay I'm writing for them, and I'm planning on, if you're okay with it, publishing this interview on YouTube, just for my own posterity and for others to look on if they're curious.
Yeah. I didn't realize you were going to do that. I might have, but I don't think I've said anything that I wouldn't.
No.
I don't think I've said anything that I would regret millions of people, or even a few dozen people hearing. No, that's fine. That's fine.
Awesome. Yeah, I will send you the questions, because I do have a few more that I'd love to get your take on.
Okay.
But I just appreciate you joining me here today, sir. And
no, not at all. Well, and you know, enterprising of you to get hold of me and ask this stuff, and it's made me think about things too. Thanks for that. All right.
Very cool. Take care, sir.
And you. Good luck. Bye-bye.